Okay, welcome everybody. Let me very briefly introduce myself and my colleague Francesco Tedeschi. We are professor at the Catholic University, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore a Milan. And we are here in order to discuss, to open in some way a discussion about the Genesis project, which is, as you know, a very complex proposal about art and philosophy of art and critics of art, history of art, where the art is understood as a tool for respect and improving human rights. We have a really important guest today, with which we will discuss, which is Professor Martin, a very important person in the promotion, critique of the African art, responsible of interesting exhibitions, and writer of absolutely important essays. I would like to ask Professor Martin, which is here with us, to present himself to very, not so very, but shortly, telling us which are the main steps of his incredible career, if I can say. Okay, so please, Professor Martin.
Yes, good afternoon. I will talk mainly about, an exhibition which is now very well known and has become almost legendary, the exhibition Magicien de la Terre, but I will talk also about the following of it and what it has become and how it can be considered nowadays, because this exhibition took place in 1989, so it's almost it's 30 years old, and what has become of it and what we can think about it today. Well, the exhibition aim was actually to show that there was visual art in the whole world. At that time, in the 80s, there were so-called international contemporary art exhibitions, and they were very simply reduced only on artists of Western Europe, not even artists from Eastern Europe, because they were behind the Iron Curtain, and artists from North America. Sometimes there were a few of them from South America, and that was all. No Africa, no Oceania, and nothing from Asia. And I found that so shocking that I decided to make this exhibition, which was very simply, more or less, half of, let's say, the so-called major artists of the Western world of that time, or at least the well-known artists. And on the other side, a half of other artists whose majority were absolutely unknown, which meant to go abroad, to travel, to look for it, to look for artists that people had never seen, because nobody had traveled and had the curiosity to look for visual arts, living artists in other continents. There was no bibliography, no writings, no books, almost nothing. So we started from scratch, and with the help of some ethnologists, actually, who traveled a lot, or some people who had interest in all these countries, we gathered a lot of information, and then I sent about my collaborators, and I traveled myself in many countries, and we assembled some of our artists, and I must say that quite a few of them are nowadays artists that are well known in the normal network of the contemporary art world. So, well, the point which is for me very important is that we were looking not only for artists who were so-called modern artists. Of course, they were in Africa art schools, and they were artists that had been taught in the formula, in the system of Western art, have been taught about modern art, and we're doing that. But I thought from the beginning that if I was presenting these artists, or most of them, would be considered here in Europe right away as second-rate artists, copyists that were influenced by us and that we could find interesting, but that most of the critics and commentators would actually reject as non-valuable and uninteresting. And so I thought it would be much more interesting to look for artists that were working in their communities and working for their communities, sometimes in a religious context or in a context completely different from ours, working more or less in their traditions that have evolved. We have to get rid of these stupid ideas that we have an art that evolves and the art of the others is just a copy of what the ancestors do or what the fathers or grandfathers did, and copying a tradition. We have a tradition, it evolves, but they have traditions and they evolve also. And they evolved a lot with the colonial system and in regard and in connection with the colonialist system, because they know about the West, of course, at a different level, of course, but they know about it and they have their way to react to that. So these were very interesting discoveries we made. And well, I tried to get rid of ideas, of preconceived ideas we have here. It was very difficult, of course, to get to escape a sort of ethnocentrist point of view. I tried to have as large vision and point of view, but of course you never escape your education and the place you come from. The important criteria for us were to work with individuals. I started with the idea that art is always made by individuals, and that we should find people who were talented, who had the capacity and energy to express themselves within their context in a way that is proper to be understood also in our countries. And if I think now of what has happened since then in the Western world, of course, many international exhibitions nowadays take in account these new contexts, that we are in a globalization, and that we need to include artists from the other continents. But the big difference is that what I did was, as I said, looking for artists sometimes who were not strictly connected to the modern system of the West, and they were working still for their communities in a sort of old closed system, as the so-called indigenous cultures still do nowadays. And even today, when I talk about these artists, the term who comes back all the time is craft. They're supposedly they're doing craftsmanship, but nobody tries to think how much this idea of the difference of art and craft is typical of our culture, and it has a meaning and a sense in our culture. But how can we apply that to a guy in a village in Africa who is making some sculptures or some masks for a festival? I mean, it just has no meaning to try to decide whether he's one side or another. And what I mean is that all the artists we have seen recently in the international exhibition in the West were all artists that were more or less connecting with with modernism. And I have nothing against this. There are many good artists and very interesting and talented artists. But what we still continue to ignore completely is an enormous amount of visual expression that exists all over the world, mostly in the field of religion. And for this, we have absolutely no interest because it's not on the market and because our system of contemporary art is still driven by the market. Well, I think now you certainly have some questions about this.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I give the floor to Professor Francesco Tedeschi, which is Professor of History of Contemporary Art. So the best discussant for this topic. Please, Francesco.
Okay. I think that it's incredible for us now to think about an exhibition that was realized no more than 30 years ago, looking at our nowadays situation. In the last 20 years, we have been accustomed to see in the international biennials and exhibition pluriannual a lot of artists from all over the world. Also, if the most part of them, as Professor Martin says, are part of the system of art, of the Western system of art. And how do you think that this changement has been possible besides of the great changement in the political system? Because political and social system, now people from all over the world works almost in the same language. Now we can say that we can recognize the positions of the artists from the different countries, from the different traditions.
Please, Professor Martin, if you want to start from this question I'm very curious.
Can you repeat exactly the question? Sorry,
Today, we can see artists from every part of the world working in Berlin, London, New York, as they were part of the same system.
Okay.
But they can also, as something of their tradition, I don't know if we can say identity or what is the way individuals are rooted in the in their ground, common in their precedent ground.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine, and for sure. But the ones that we see in this context, in this exhibition, in this network, they have been into the mold of our system, and they know how to do their strategy, to pick, to go from one institution to another, to be invited in this exhibition. Well, be an artist nowadays is a strategy, and this strategy, but it's fine. And they, of course, they say something about their own tradition. They say it in a way or another, but they are absolutely rooted in a certain mold which is ours. And what I'm just saying is that there is an enormous amount of artists that are not at all in this sort of structure, of mental, intellectual structure, and that are extremely interesting, and that we just don't want to see because they have no way to be known in our system. I made an exhibition later on, which was in Germany, in Düsseldorf. It was called in German Altäre, which are altars, shrines, and it was about religious shrines in the whole world. I invited 60 different groups, priests, and so on from all over the world to do altars of their religion and of their local culture. It was an extremely interesting in terms of colors and shapes and something incredible in terms of invention, sometimes very much connected in hybrid ways with the modernism, but that nobody had heard of and could imagine, And the question was just, is it art? Well, when it's ancient and it's before colonialism, it's perfect. It's in our museum. It's part of our collection. It's shown. But when it's for the present, we are still in this absolutely incredible Hegelian point of view, which was okay for Europe to say, well, at a certain point, art doesn't depend from religion anymore, and and then it became a sort of atheist activity. But to project that on the rest of the world is extremely naive, and that's just my point, that we're actually blind on an enormous amount of visual expressions that are happening in the world and that we don't want to see because it doesn't fit with our system market on one way, or the intellectual also in the intellectual structural system. Because the artists I'm mentioning, the ones you see in all these international exhibitions nowadays that fit in our modern system, as I said, they have understood exactly how it works in our system, how to develop their strategies to be well known, and it's fine. That's fine. It's okay, and they say something about their culture, of course, in the way they do it. I just say there is an enormous amount besides that we don't see.
Okay. And about the hybridism you were talking also, I remember that you realized another exhibition in 2000 in Lyon for the Biennale with a title that is very interesting to understand what's the different way of looking from Western to to third world, or as we can say, that is partage d'exotisme. This condivision of different exotism, because I think it's important that when we look at the artists in the most important international exhibitions, looking at them inside the system of art, sometimes we have a kind of another exotism again. We look at them like the exotic part of the art system, but it's important, as you said in that exhibition, to understand that there is a correspondent exotism that people from abroad as when they look at the situation in Italy or in France or in Germany. And I think this underlining of the condivision, the sharing of exotism is an important part of your project, of your critical project. Is it true?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because it relies on the idea that that cultures are different and that we have to accept these differences. And accepting these differences is accepting also that these other cultures are different. And so, well, this is what was called now the term is banned because it's so much linked to colonialism. But this is what we called in a few decades ago still exoticism. And I took this title, which was on purpose a little bit provocative, because actually it comes partly from an anecdote. I talked with the Chinese artist Tsai Kokyang, who is now living in New York and a well-known artist there. And he said, well, the first time he went to the United States, he said to some of people he met that he found the McDonald's very exotic, and nobody understood what he meant, you know? And this is exactly the point. Yeah.
Okay.
No, vai avanti.
And so I go back to my thinking about when I had the first impressions about Magicien de la Terre and this new perspective, because for an historian of art that started like myself in the 80s, 90s to look at the art world, that exhibition was changing the way of looking at the things. And twice for me, the exhibition and thinking of Martin has been very, very important. Once thinking about my interest in the relationships between art and geography. Geography considered not like cartography, and in Pompidou in 1980 there was an important exhibition, Carte Figure de la Terre,
Yep.
that considered the importance of looking at the history through geography too. And I think that in Magicien de la Terre there was a kind of rearranging of the map of the world. And that exhibition and other exhibition, like the one that you realized here in Italy or in Germany, demonstrated the changement between the relation between the self and the other, and the way colonialism has been a more subtle strategy inside the things that we look every day. For example, I remember the importance of Alfredo Jahr, Geography Equal War, that was a part of Magicien de la Terre, a work that denounces the trafficking of toxic waste from Italy to Nigeria. That is one of the hateful form of colonization. And on the other side, there was comparison, such as that one between Alighiero Boetti, who brought to the exhibition tapestries with text by Sufi Barang from Pakistan, and an Ivorian artist, Frédéric Boisbré, or also the one from between Richard Long and the Australian Aboriginal artist of the Wendumu community that realized work about the map of dreams, as we know, also the map of the songs of as Bruce Chatwin called them. So there is a kind of mental map, mental geography of the people, of the artist, that is changing. But that year, the entire world changed his map. It's very interesting that in that year we finished the Cold War with the end of the wall in Berlin, and so have you talked about the incredible chronology in which that exhibition fall in that moment?
Yeah, but I can tell you about also the process, how it happened, because at that time in the 80s, the two words in French, mondialisation and globalisation, didn't exist. And actually, I used to read newspaper Le Monde very regularly, and of course there were the headlines and the topics. But when you read newspapers like that very carefully, going into the little articles that have only a few lines and so on, you were struck by the fact that the world was already totally interconnected economically and politically, that little events happening somewhere in Asia or Africa could have consequences that were very important actually in our countries. And so I was absolutely convinced that this interconnection that afterwards we called globalisation, mondialisation en français, was something that was very important. And this is why I thought, well, how can it come that this world is already so much interconnected, and in the visual art, we do as if it wouldn't exist, as if there were nothing there. And this is why afterwards I was interested actually in maps at the time of the elaboration of the organization of the exhibition, because I had we had in the office where we were working this map of Australia, which was reversed. The north is south and the south is north. And in Australia, it's quite well known and it says a lot right away. You just had to look at it, and then the things are reversed, and your point of view, our very wealthy, normal point of view of the North is reversed, and you have to change your vision and your point of view. And this is why in the catalogue of the exhibition, there was a little map of the world next to the images of the work of each artist. For each artist double page, he had a little map, and at each time, the place where he was working was the center of the map and the center of the world. And this said a lot. And this is exactly how I liked to work. In the catalogue also at that time, a very important article about the relation of Europe and all the other cultures and the colonization, and this story that goes back to of course, to the 15th and 16th century. we tried to make a sort of resume of it, mostly in images. It was done with little text. And mostly with images, and we have so many things that goes back to all these relations with other cultures. And I think this was not understood because many academics, especially many people in university, rely so much on academic text. And my text was very short in the catalogue. And I think this brought to some misunderstandings of the exhibition just before, because also it wasn't following the usual structures and schemes that are normally expected in this kind of event.
Thank you. We have a question by Marco Parigi. I can read it. One question for Martin. Which young African artists today, in your opinion, are the most interesting, and how has African art changed from the late 18th to today?
Well, I hate to make name dropping, but I can, of course, I can, well, give some names like Romuald Azoumé, Pascal Martin Taillou. Well, I could give, well, the quite a few very interesting artists that are around nowadays. But you have to remember that or Barthélemy Togo, that most of them usually have a foot in either in North America, in New York, or in London or Paris. You know, there are only very few of them, of the ones who are the most successful ones, actually reside in Africa. Well, let's say the interest of art, as we understand it, again in the scheme and in the system as the Western world has set it up. This system is slowly becoming now coming in some of the countries of Africa, but it's very difficult to talk of Africa as a whole, because, you know, it's a whole continent and there are so many things happening and so many different cultures there that it's very difficult. Well, of course, there is Northern Africa with Morocco, for instance, which has a real, say, system of the arts comparable to ours, with galleries, with collectors, with a magazine about art and so on. There is South Africa, which has also institutions and collectors and galleries. And in between, there are only a few countries who have maybe galleries and a school of art and something like that, and many have just nothing. So the situations are so different that it would take whole several lectures to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I really interested from your discussion as a sociologist of culture, and obviously the problem you touch in your discussion is a bit the problem of the mainstream and the change in what we call the mainstream culture. During the 60s and the 70s in particular, this has been pointed out as a big problem. No, the problem of presumed centrality of the Western countries, the Western culture, in particular of the USA culture in popular culture. And now we are facing a new situation. We are more sensitive about the complexity of the culture. And I think today it's quite impossible to speak about a global culture, but a global culture is the very focus of the discussion. No, just one thing. I don't know if you too agree, but what I try to explain to my students every year is that the globalization is not the fact that everything is everywhere. And so what we told us about the plurality of Africa is another interesting point. No? So when we speak about Africa as a continent, as a unique place, obviously we make a big misunderstanding. No, Africa is plural, exactly like the global culture is plural. But just one thing still. So I would like to ask you one thing. What do you think about the role played by digitalization in the change of our perception of plurality? So now we have the possibility to accede to many things, museums, expositions, exhibitions, and so on, from distance, in remote. We have a lot of possibility for artists to present themselves in a context like the pandemic, for instance, where it was impossible to travel. So how do you think this new mediascape changed also the perception of the plurality in the art? For both of you, if I can.
Of course, it changed totally the situation compared to the late 80s. You know, I usually say we were able to make Magicien de la Terre because we had the facts. The facts was absolutely new at that time. And this is what allowed us to make all these connections in the world. Now, of course, it's so different. I mean, things had totally changed. And the problem now is at the contrary, exactly the contrary of what was my problem in the 80s. It was to actually to find the information, you know, and to have it and to know about what's happening in these remote countries. But nowadays, we have such an enormous amount of information, not about everything, as I said before, but nevertheless, an enormous amount of information. And the problem for each of us is to make the selection and how to work with so many informations and how to select it and how to make choices. You know, this is the enormous point for any curator nowadays, I think. So, and also when you say about when you talk about, well, this access we have to many events through and exhibitions that we can see on internet or whatever, that's fine. It gives again a lot of information, but there I would go back to my original profession, which is museum curator, and I still believe and I still stick to that very strongly, that nothing can replace the contact of anybody with a physical object, you know. And I think museums will still have a life in the future.
Okay, and I agree, and I think that we have to think about two way of looking at this situation confronting to the art. One is the present, and the present is that almost everything could be everywhere. Almost everyone could be everywhere and have a relation with everyone else. And so for the works of art, the works can, the image of the images of the works can travel in a nanosecond. But looking at the past, we are in a kind of all concentrated memory. But for that, it seems that everything that happened could be part of our present. But we have to look at the different traditions to understand from where everything comes. And when you were talking about African art, I was trying to say that for me, it was very important to discover with another exhibition, not by Jean-Hubert Martin, but I think that he could appreciate that exhibition. The exhibition was Africa, realized by Tom Phillips in London and then in Germany. I saw it in Berlin. And it was a discovery for everyone that was looking at that exhibition, because it demonstrated how African art, African cultures, the plurals is important, were and are rich. And one of the banal observation that in our country, for example, we used to say that we have a large part of the cultural heritage of the world, would be almost cancelled by an exhibition like that one. Because starting from the Egyptian Copt icons, to the Arab carpets, to the South African, to the important Nigerian art and so on, Africa is very rich by tradition. And now we have to understand that African contemporary art is rich of that tradition, but also of the present situation, that is ever-changing, ever-relationed situation between artists that travel all over the world by themselves or by the devices they use. Also that, so I think I agree with Monsieur Martin that we need to have a physical contact with the object of art. And we in the university that has realized for 2 years courses only by computer, presented almost the same text and content, but the big problem was not to have the physical contact with the object of art. But we need to understand that the world has changed, and we have to we have a big opportunity, a lot of opportunities, but we almost have to travel for knowing also the cultures into which the art of today has grown.
Yes. Another thing that I see another question on the screen. Lorenzo Papini. Today, the art market promotes so much contemporary African art, and everyone is aware of the importance of African art. Why is the contemporary African art still rarely studied in European universities? Good question, not only for you, Professor Martin, but also for my colleagues.
That's more for you. That's
probably more for him than for you.
But one has to be a little bit careful with that, because there are all these fashionable effect, you know. I'm certainly one of the curators responsible for this fashion now, African art. I cannot say much against it, because actually I worked so hard to make African art recognized, that now that it's everywhere in the media, well, I cannot say much negative about it, but I'm very suspicious always when it's only the market. That suddenly, well, some people say, "Oh, well, this is very interesting, and maybe it's a little bit cheaper than European art, and how not make money with that, and so on." Well, there are all sorts of interest behind that I'm not interested in at all. But it's true that, what was interesting is that when we did with several colleagues this exhibition Africa Remix, it started in Düsseldorf in 2004 or something like that, four or five. We were surprised that we got an enormous media coverage about it. The public attendance was not enormous, but there was an enormous coverage of the media, and the media were interested in actually in talking about Africa on a cultural level and about art in a positive way, instead of having to talk all the time about the disasters and the economy and the political events that are quite negative very often, and so on. And so it was a way for them to say something different and positive, and it worked. And nowadays, suddenly there's this fashion. But remember that the Western art market, I mean, the art market that drives the whole thing, it needs always to have a sort of focus on something. We had a certain point just after 89, the fall of the wall, and the disappearance of USSR. We had this fashion for Russian art, certainly. Now nobody talks anymore about the artist in Moscow. Now afterwards we had the fashion of the China, and now we have a fashionable thing about Africa, and probably in a few years will be something different. So we have to be very careful about that, because this is very much linked to sort of very mediatic enthusiasm, and after a while it disappears, and what's important is left over afterwards.
If I have to say something about the question of Lorenzo Papini, I can say that in Italy there are a few courses about African or extra Western art, but in looking at the historical and traditional art. And but when we think about contemporary art, we cannot avoid African art, because contemporary art is not African or European, but is a world art. If we look at our 21st century art, it's true that in the system of the university in Italy, the university system in Italy, history of art, of contemporary art, as usually teach. We usually teach 20th century art, and so some of my colleagues has some difficulties, for example, to look at the art of the second post-war art in their courses. But I think that in a few years, surely will start some changement also in the university system to open up some new courses, because it's true that at the moment there is a few space, very few space for African or also Asian contemporary art, only in some of our in the parts of our most advanced courses.
Thank you. I just have another comment, I would say. I also was interested by the idea of geographical distance, no, as a part of your discussion just 10 minutes ago. I would like to ask you something about what I would say the time distance. No, actually, we are facing a very interesting phenomenon from the point of view of the culture, which is the so-called cancel culture. No, a way for looking at the past with a critical approach, which is good, but sometimes deleting the less good part of the past. No, so modify or cancelling some part of a statue, and in less political and more extended way is part of this cancel culture also the way a Dubai exposition they present the Michelangelo artworks, removing actually part of the statues and so on. So what do you think about the role we have to play as intellectual in the relation with the past of the art, the respect for the historically defined pieces of art, masterpiece, and so on? I don't know if my question is clear. In my mind, it's very clear. I don't know in my English and in my presentation in general.
Well, I'm absolutely against this cancel culture, of course. I mean, studying and understanding history is very parallel, very similar to understanding other culture. It's understanding completely different contexts, completely different ways of thinking, which is actually very difficult in history. And this means that in the memory of our culture and the memory which is present through objects in the public space or in museums or whatever, we have to respect them as they were. Well, if you, I don't know this story you mentioned about Dubai and Michelangelo, but I think whether the works are presented as they are and as they are seen and understood in our context, and if they cannot cope with that, then they shouldn't show them, and that's all, you know. But I'm a bit well. I don't know about Dubai, but I know a little bit about the situation of the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, and so on. And what I have known until now from the way the people in charge of the Louvre Abu Dhabi handle things, they're extremely open and much more open than the media ever said they would be. You know. So, well, this is a precise question, but in general, we have, I mean, as well as we respect any work of art coming from another culture, and we try to show it with as much respect as we can. I mean, we have, if our works of art are going in other regions and are shown in other cultures, the same respect has to be given to our works and to our culture, of course.
Please, Francesco.
I think that your question was inside a part of another problem, of a big problem that the team into which we are discussing is a part of. Because we know that in the intellectual and radical position of Anglo-Saxon, American, North American universities, for example, the complaints against the position of a cultural history of the Western world has led to a kind of reaction of a reversal operation into which, for example, now in the United States and in Canada, in the museums, they sell the works of art from the big artists of American 20th century art to buy artists from works from the artists of Afro-American art for reaching a kind of equilibrium between the two. And it's a kind of fight important for a certain kind of vision, but it could be problematic in another kind of looking. Also, it's important to open the doors, but we cannot close other doors. For example, when we think about the cancel culture of covering or destroying some monuments, I'm thinking about some oldest monuments that shows a lot of colonization, like the Colonna Traiana or Colosseum. They would be monuments to destroy. If we go radically at the sources of the colonial way of looking at the world, they could. But naturally, it's out of our discussion. And but this changement of perspective, this radical change of perspective is important. And I think I would like to know by Jean-Hubert Martin what he thinks about also if I want to also say that Michelangelo was had also some censorship in the 16th century.
Yeah,
before
exactly.
That's true.
and in Western countries,
Yes,
not
in the same place,
not in the other side of the world. So,
yeah, it's an old discussion, actually. yeah. Vasari helped a lot there. Yeah, okay. Well, my point of view is, well, if we talk about contemporary art and the way we handle art, I mean, a curator of exhibition is the one who decides about the content of his show, and it makes, of course, he makes a statement with the selection of artists he's showing to the public. And I think there that we could keep a total freedom. And of course, you can understand that I could have never done the exhibition Magicien de la Terre if I had worked with the UNESCO. Because if I had worked with UNESCO, right away, I would have been there with statistics, with so much amount. This country, which has this population, needs to have one artist, the other one two, and so on. And this would have been totally destroying the level of aesthetics and of artistic value of course, of a certain time seen by a person like me, but it would have been absolutely impossible. Already at that time, I had discussions with some colleagues or critics of the United States who told me, "Oh, your exhibition is very interesting. So you're going to put some black artists there, black American artists, and so on." I said, possibly, if I find that their artistic statements and works are for me relevant for my shows, and that if I think they are at a certain level of quality, and this is something I really stick to, and in no way I would ever do an exhibition where I had this pressure, ideological or political, to put so many artists of this type or that type.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry, but we have to close our discussion. We are just in time, 1 hour of discussion. It has been a real fantastic to discuss with both of you. So thank you so much. Thank you to the audience that listen, I hope, with pleasure, not our discussion. So see you for the next meeting, and thank you so much. Good evening to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Grazie, Martin.